The Expedition of Humphry Clinker. By Tobias Smollett. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Lewis, I received your bill upon Wiltshire, which was punctually honoured, but as I don't choose to keep so much cash by me, in a common lodging house, I have deposited 250 litres in the Bank of Bath, and shall take their bills for it in London, when I leave this place, where the season draws to an end. You must know, that now being afoot, I am resolved to give Lydia a glimpse of London. She is one of the best-hearted creatures I ever knew, and gains upon my affection every day. As for Tabby, I have dropped such hints to the Irish baronet, concerning her fortune, as, I make no doubt, will cool the ardour of his addresses. Then her pride will take the alarm, and the rancour of stale maidenhood being chafed, we shall hear nothing but slander and abuse of Sir Alec McIlligott. This rupture, I foresee, will facilitate our departure from Bath, where, at present, Tabby seems to enjoy herself with peculiar satisfaction. For my part, I detest it so much, that I should not have been able to stay so long in the place if I had not discovered some old friends, whose conversation alleviates my disgust. Going to the coffee-house one forenoon, I could not help contemplating the company, with equal surprise and compassion. We consisted of 13 individuals, 7 lamed by the gout, rheumatism, or palsy, 3 maimed by accident, and the rest either deaf or blind. One hobbled, another hopped, a third dragged his legs after him like a wounded snake, a fourth straddled betwixt a pair of long crutches, like the mummy of a felon hanging in chains, a fifth was bent into a horizontal position, like a mounted telescope, shoved in by a couple of chairmen, and a sixth was the bust of a man, set upright in a wheel machine, which the waiter moved from place to place. Being struck with some of their faces, I consulted the subscription book, and, perceiving the names of several old friends, began to consider the group with more attention. At length I discovered Rear Admiral Baldrick, the companion of my youth, whom I had not seen since he was appointed lieutenant of the Severn. He was metamorphosed into an old man, with a wooden leg and a weather-beaten face, which appeared the more ancient from his grey locks, that were truly venerable. Sitting down at the table, where he was reading a newspaper, I gazed at him for some minutes, with a mixture of pleasure and regret, which made my heart gush with tenderness. Then, taking him by the hand, "Ah, Sam," said I, "40 years ago I little thought I was too much moved to proceed." "An old friend, sure enough," cried he, squeezing my hand, and surveying me eagerly through his glasses. "I know the looming of the vessel, though she has been hard strained since we parted, but I can't heave up the name." The moment I told him who I was, he exclaimed, "Ha! Matt, my old fellow cruiser, still afloat," and, starting up, hugged me in his arms. His transport, however, boded me no good, for, in saluting me, he thrust the spring of his spectacles into my eye, and, at the same time, set his wooden stump upon my gouty toe, an attack that made me shed tears in sad earnest. After the hurry of our recognition was over, he pointed out 2 of our common friends in the room. The bust was what remained of Colonel Cockerell, who had lost the use of his limbs in making an American campaign, and the telescope proved to be my college chum, Sir Reginald Bentley, who, with his new title, and unexpected inheritance, commenced fox hunter, without having served his apprenticeship to the mystery, and, in consequence of following the hounds through a river, was seized with an inflammation of his bowels, which has contracted him into his present attitude. Our former correspondence was forthwith renewed, with the most hearty expressions of mutual goodwill, and as we had met so unexpectedly, we agreed to dine together that very day at the tavern. My friend Quinn, being luckily unengaged, obliged us with his company, and, truly, this the most happy day I have passed these 20 years. You and I, Lewis, having been always together, never tasted friendship in this high gout, contracted from long absence. I cannot express the half of what I felt at this casual meeting of 3 or 4 companions, who had been so long separated, and so roughly treated by the storms of life. It was a renovation, of youth, a kind of resuscitation of the dead, that realized those interesting dreams, in which we sometimes retrieve our ancient friends from the grave. Perhaps my enjoyment was not the less pleasing for being mixed with a strain of melancholy, produced by the remembrance of past scenes, that conjured up the ideas of some endearing connections, which the hand of death has actually dissolved. The spirits and good humor of the company seemed to triumph over the wreck of their constitutions. They had even philosophy enough to joke upon their own calamities, such as the power of friendship, the sovereign cordial of life. I afterwards found, however, that they were not without their moments, and even hours of disquiet. Each of them apart, in succeeding conferences, expatiated upon his own particular grievances, and they were all malcontents at bottom. Over and above their personal disasters, they thought themselves unfortunate in the lottery of life. Baldric complained that all the recompense he had received for his long and hard service was the half-pay of a rear admiral. The colonel was mortified to see himself overtopped by upstart generals, some of whom he had once commanded, and, being a man of a liberal turn, could ill put up with a moderate annuity, for which he had sold his commission. As for the baronet, having run himself considerably in debt, on a contested election, he has been obliged to relinquish his seat in Parliament, and his seat in the country at the same time, and put his estate to nurse, but his chagrin, which is the effect of his own misconduct, does not affect me half so much as that of the other two, who have acted honorable and distinguished parts on the great theatre, and are now reduced to lead a weary life in this stewpan of idleness and insignificance. They have long left off using the waters, after having experienced their inefficacy. The diversions of the place they are not in a condition to enjoy. How then do they make shift to pass their time? In the forenoon they crawl out to the rooms or the coffee-house, where they take a hand at whist, or descant upon the general advertiser, and their evenings they murder in private parties, among peevish invalids, and insipid old women. This is the case with a good number of individuals, whom nature seems to have intended for better purposes. About a dozen years ago, many decent families, restricted to small fortunes, besides those that came hither on the score of health, were tempted to settle at Bath, where they could then live comfortably, and even make a genteel appearance, at a small expense, but the madness of the times has made the place too hot for them, and they are now obliged to think of other migrations. Some have already fled to the mountains of Wales, and others have retired to Exeter. Thither, no doubt, they will be followed by the flood of luxury and extravagance, which will drive them from place to the very land's end, and there, I suppose, they will be obliged to ship themselves to some other country. Bath is become a mere sink of profligacy and extortion. Every article of housekeeping is raised to an enormous price, a circumstance no longer to be wondered at, when we know that every petty retainer of fortune piques himself upon keeping a table, and thinks it is for the honor of his character to wink at the knavery of his servants, who are in a confederacy with the market people, and, of consequence, pay whatever they demand. Here is now a mushroom of opulence, who pays a cook 70 guineas a week for furnishing him with one meal a day. This portentous frenzy is become so contagious, that the very rabble and refuse of mankind are infected. I have known a negro driver, from Jamaica, pay overnight, to the master of one of the rooms, 65 guineas for tea and coffee to the company, and leave Bath next morning, in such obscurity, that not one of his guests had the slightest idea of his person, or even made the least inquiry about his name. Incidents of this kind are frequent, and every day teems with fresh absurdities, which are too gross to make a thinking man merry. But I feel the spleen creeping on me apace, and therefore will indulge you with a cessation, that you may have no unnecessary cause to curse your correspondence with, dear Dick, yours ever, Matt. Bramble, Bath, May. To Miss Letitia Willis, at Gloucester. My dear Letty, I wrote you at great length by the post, the 26th of last month, to which I refer you for an account of our proceedings at Bath, and I expect your answer with impatience. But, having this opportunity of a private hand, I send you 24 of Bath rings, 6 of the best of which I desire you will keep for yourself, and distribute the rest among the young ladies, our common friends, as you shall think proper. I don't know how you will approve of the mottos, some of them are not much to my own liking, but I was obliged to take such as I could find ready manufactured. I am vexed that neither you nor I have received any further information of a certain person. Sure it cannot be wilful neglect! Oh my dear Willis. I begin to be visited by strange fancies, and to have some melancholy doubts, which, however, it would be ungenerous to harbor without further inquiry. My uncle, who has made me a present of a very fine set of garnets, talks of treating us with a jaunt to London, which, you may imagine, will be highly agreeable, but I like Bath so well, that I hope he won't think of leaving it till the season is quite over, and, yet, betwixt friends, something has happened to my aunt, which will probably shorten our stay in this place. Yesterday, in the forenoon, she went by herself to a breakfasting in one of the rooms, and, in half an hour, returned in great agitation, having Chowder along with her in the chair. I believe some accident must have happened to that unlucky animal, which is the great source of all her troubles. Dear Letty! What a pity it is, that a woman of her years and discretion, should place her affection upon such an ugly, ill-conditioned cur, that snarls and snaps at everybody. I asked John Thomas, the footman who attended her, what was the matter? And he did nothing but grin. A famous dog doctor was sent for, and undertook to cure the patient, provided he might carry him home to his own house, but his mistress would not part with him out of her own sight. She ordered the cook to warm cloths, which she applied to his bowels, with her own hand. She gave up all thoughts of going to the ball in the evening, and when Sir Alec came to drink tea, refused to be seen, so that he went away to look for another partner. My brother Jery whistles and dances. My uncle sometimes shrugs up his shoulders, and sometimes bursts out a-laughing. My aunt sobs and scolds by turns, and her woman, Win. Jenkins, stares and wonders with a foolish face of curiosity, and, for my part, I am as curious as she, but ashamed to ask questions. Perhaps time will discover the mystery, for if it was anything that happened in the rooms, it cannot be long concealed. All I know is, that last night at supper, Miss Bramble spoke very disdainfully of Sir Alec McIlligott, and asked her brother if he intended to keep us sweltering all the summer at Bath. No, Sister Tabitha, said he, with an arch smile, we shall retreat before the dog days begin, though I make no doubt, that with a little temperance and discretion, our constitutions might be kept cool enough all the year, even at Bath. As I don't know the meaning of this insinuation, I won't pretend to make any remarks upon it at present. Hereafter, perhaps, I may be able to explain it more to your satisfaction. In the meantime, I beg you will be punctual in your correspondence, and continue to love your ever faithful Lydia Melford. Bath, May. To Sir Watkin Phillips, of Jesus College, Uxon. So then Mrs. Blackerby's affair has proved a false alarm, and I have saved my money. I wish, however, her declaration had not been so premature, for though my being thought capable of making her a mother, might have given me some credit, the reputation of an intrigue with such a cracked pitcher does me no honor at all. In my last I told you I had hopes of seeing Quin, in his hours of elevation at the tavern which is the temple of mirth and good fellowship, where he, as priest of Comus, utters the inspirations of wit and humor. I have had that satisfaction. I have dined with his club at the Three Tuns, and had the honor to sit him out. At half an hour past 8 in the evening, he was carried home with 6 good bottles of claret under his belt, and it being then Friday, he gave orders that he should not be disturbed till Sunday at noon. You must not imagine that this dose had any other effect upon his conversation, but that of making it more extravagantly entertaining. He had lost the use of his limbs, indeed, several hours before we parted, but he retained all his other faculties in perfection, and as he gave vent to every whimsical idea as it rose, I was really astonished at the brilliancy of his thoughts, and the force of his expression. Quin is a real voluptuary in the articles of eating and drinking, and so confirmed an epicure, in the common acceptation of the term, that he cannot put up with ordinary fare. This is a point of such importance with him, that he always takes upon himself the charge of catering, and a man, admitted to his mess, is always sure of eating delicate victuals, and drinking excellent wine. He owns himself addicted to the delights of the stomach, and often jokes upon his own sensuality, but there is nothing selfish in this appetite. He finds that good cheer unites good company, exhilarates the spirits, opens the heart, banishes all restraint from conversation, and promotes the happiest purposes of social life. But Mr. James Quin is not a subject to be discussed in the compass of one letter. I shall therefore, at present, leave him to his repose, and call another of a very different complexion. You desire to have further acquaintance with the person of our aunt, and promise yourself much entertainment from her connection with Sir Alec McIlligott, but in this hope you are balked, already. That connection is dissolved. The Irish baronet is an old hound, that, finding her carrion, has quitted the scent. I have already told you, that Mrs. Tabitha Bramble is a maiden of 45. In her person, she is tall, raw-boned, awkward, flat-chested, and stooping. Her complexion is sallow and freckled, her eyes are not grey, but greenish, like those of a cat, and generally inflamed. Her hair is of a sandy, or rather dusty hue, her forehead low, her nose long, sharp, and, towards the extremity, always red in cool weather, her lips skinny, her mouth extensive, her teeth straggling and loose, of various colors and conformation, and her long neck shriveled into 1,000 wrinkles. In her temper, she is proud, stiff, vain, imperious, prying, malicious, greedy, and uncharitable. In all likelihood, her natural austerity has been soured by disappointment in love, for her long celibacy is by no means owing to her dislike of matrimony. On the contrary, she has left no stone unturned to avoid the reproachful epithet of old maid. Before I was born, she had gone such lengths in the way of flirting with a recruiting officer, that her reputation was a little singed. She afterwards made advances to the curate of the parish, who dropped some distant hints about the next presentation to the living, which was in her brother's gift, but finding that was already promised to another, he flew off at a tangent, and Mrs. Tabby, in revenge, found means to deprive him of his cure. Her next lover was lieutenant of a man of war, a relation of the family, who did not understand the refinements of the passion, and expressed no aversion to grapple with cousin Tabby in the way of marriage, but before matters could be properly adjusted, he went out on a cruise, and was killed in an engagement with a French frigate. Our aunt, though baffled so often, did not yet despair. She laid all her snares for Dr. Lewis, who is the fides sacates of my uncle. She even fell sick upon the occasion, and prevailed with Matt to interpose in her behalf with his friend, but the doctor, being a shycock, would not be caught with chaff, and flatly rejected the proposal, so that Mrs. Tabitha was content to exert her patience once more, after having endeavored in vain to effect a rupture betwixt the two friends, and now she thinks proper to be very civil to Lewis, who is become necessary to her in the way of his profession. All these, however, are not the only efforts she has made towards a nearer conjunction with our sex. Her fortune was originally no more than £1,000, but she gained an accession of 500 by the death of a sister, and the lieutenant left her 300 in his will. These sums she has more than doubled, by living free of all expense, in her brother's house, and dealing in cheese and Welsh flannel, the produce of his flocks and dairy. At present her capital is increased to about £4,000, and her avarice seems to grow every day more and more rapacious, but even this is not so intolerable as the perverseness of her nature, which keeps the whole family in disquiet and uproar. She is one of those geniuses who find some diabolical enjoyment in being dreaded and detested by their fellow creatures. I once told my uncle, I was surprised that a man of his disposition could bear such a domestic plague, when it could be so easily removed. The remark made him sore, because it seemed to tax him with want of resolution, wrinkling up his nose, and drawing down his eyebrows. "A young fellow," said he, "when he first thrusts his snout into the world, is apt to be surprised at many things which a man of experience knows to be ordinary and unavoidable. This precious aunt of yours is become insensibly a part of my constitution, damn her. She's an alimy tangier in my flesh, which I cannot bear to be touched or tampered with." I made no reply, but shifted the conversation. He really has an affection for this original, which maintains its ground in defiance of common sense, and in despite of that contempt which he must certainly feel for her character and understanding. Nay, I am convinced that she has likewise a most virulent attachment to his person, though her love never shows itself but in the shape of discontent, and she persists in tormenting him out of pure tenderness. The only object within doors upon which she bestows any marks of affection, in the usual style, is her dog Chowder, a filthy cur from Newfoundland, which she had in a present from the wife of a skipper in Swansea. One would imagine she had distinguished this beast with her favor on account of his ugliness and ill nature, if it was not, indeed, an instinctive sympathy between his disposition and her own. Certain it is, she caresses him, without ceasing, and even harasses the family in the service of this cursed animal, which, indeed, has proved the proximate cause of her breach with Sir Alec McKilligut. You must know, she yesterday wanted to steal a march of poor Liddy, and went to breakfast in the room without any other companion than her dog, in expectation of meeting with the baronet, who had agreed to dance with her in the evening. Chowder no sooner made his appearance in the room, than the master of the ceremonies, incensed at his presumption, ran up to drive him away, and threatened him with his foot, but the other seemed to despise his authority, and displaying a formidable case of long, white, sharp teeth, kept the puny monarch at bay, while he stood under some trepidation, fronting his antagonist, and bawling to the waiter. Sir Alec McKilligut came to his assistance, and seeming ignorant of the connection between this intruder and his mistress, gave the former such a kick in the jaws, as sent him howling to the door. Mrs. Tabitha, incensed at this outrage, ran after him, squalling in a tone equally disagreeable, while the baronet followed her on one side, making apologies for his mistake, and Derek on the other, making remonstrances upon the rules and regulations of the place. Far from being satisfied with the knight's excuses, she said she was sure he was no gentleman, and when the master of the ceremonies offered to hand her into the chair, she rapped him over the knuckles with her fan. My uncle's footman being still at the door, she and Chowder got into the same vehicle, and were carried off. Amidst the jokes of the chairman and other populace, I had been riding out on Clerkendown, and happened to enter just as the fracas was over. The baronet, coming up to me with an affected air of chagrin, recounted the adventure, at which I laughed heartily, and then his countenance cleared up. "My dear soul," said he, "when I saw a sort of a wild beast, snarling with open mouth at the master of the ceremonies, like the red cow going to devour Tom Thumb, I could do no less than go to the assistance of the little man, but I never dreamt the beast was one of Mrs. Bramble's attendants. Oh! If I had, he might have made his breakfast upon Derek and welcome, but you know, my dear friend, how natural it is for us Irishmen to blunder, and to take the wrong so by the ear. However, I will confess judgment, and cry her mercy, and it is to be hoped a penitent sinner may be forgiven." I told him that as the offense was not voluntary of his side, it was to be hoped he would not find her implacable. But, in truth, all this concern was dissembled. In his approaches of gallantry to Mrs. Tabitha, he had been misled by a mistake of at least £6,000, in the calculation of her fortune, and in this particular he was just undeceived. He, therefore, seized the first opportunity of incurring her displeasure decently, in such a manner as would certainly annihilate the correspondence, and he could not have taken a more effectual method than that of beating her dog. When he presented himself at our door, to pay his respects to the offended fair, he was refused admittance, and given to understand that he should never find her at home for the future. She was not so inaccessible to Derek, who came to demand satisfaction for the insult she had offered to him, even in the verge of his own court. She knew it was convenient to be well with the master of the ceremonies, while she continued to frequent the rooms, and, having heard he was a poet, began to be afraid of making her appearance in a ballad or lampoon. She therefore made excuses for what she had done, imputing it to the flutter of her spirits, and subscribed handsomely for his poems, so that he was perfectly appeased, and overwhelmed her with a profusion of compliment. He even solicited a reconciliation with Chowder, which, however, the latter declined, and he declared that if he could find a precedent in the annals of the Bath, which he would carefully examine for that purpose, her favourite should be admitted to the next public breakfasting, but, I believe, she will not expose herself or him to the risque of a second disgrace. Who will supply the place of Macilligut in her affections, I cannot foresee, but nothing in the shape of man can come amiss. Though she is a violent churchwoman, of the most intolerant zeal, I believe in my conscience, she would have no objection, at present, to treat on the score of matrimony with an Anabaptist, Quaker, or Jew, and even ratify the treaty at the expense of her own conversion. But, perhaps, I think too hardly of this kinswoman, who, I must own, is very little beholden to the good opinion of yours, J. Melford. To Dr. Lewis. You ask me, why I don't take the airy horseback, during this fine weather ? In which of the avenues of this paradise would you have me take that exercise? Shall I commit myself to the highroads of London or Bristol, to be stifled with dust, or pressed to death in the midst of post-chaises, flying machines, wagons, and coal horses, besides the troops of fine gentlemen that take to the highway, to show their horsemanship, and the coaches of fine ladies, who go thither to show their equipages? Shall I attempt the downs, and fatigue myself to death in climbing up an eternal ascent, without any hopes of reaching the summit? No then. I have made divers desperate leaps at those upper regions, but always fell backward into this vapor pit, exhausted and dispirited by those ineffectual efforts, and here we poor valetudinarians pant and struggle, like so many Chinese gudgeons, gasping in the bottom of a punch bowl. By heaven, it is a kind of enchantment. If I do not speedily break the spell, and escape, I may chance to give up the ghost in this nauseous stew of corruption. It was but 2 nights ago that I had like to have made my public exit, at a minute's warning. One of my greatest weaknesses is that of suffering myself to be overruled by the opinion of people, whose judgment I despise. I own, with shame and confusion of face, that importunity of any kind I cannot resist. This want of courage and constancy is an original flaw in my nature, which you must have often observed with compassion, if not with contempt. I am afraid some of our boasted virtues may be traced up to this defect. Without further preamble, I was persuaded to go to a ball, on purpose to see Liddy dance a minuet with a young petulant jackanapes, the only son of a wealthy undertaker from London, whose mother lodges in our neighbourhood, and has contracted an acquaintance with Tabby. I sat a couple of long hours, half stifled, in the midst of a noisome crowd, and could not help wondering that so many hundreds of those that rank as rational creatures could find entertainment in seeing a succession of insipid animals, describing the same dull figure for a whole evening, on an area not much bigger than a tailor's shop board. If there had been any beauty, grace, activity, magnificent dress, or variety of any kind howsoever absurd, to engage the attention, and amuse the fancy, I should not have been surprised, but there was no such object. It was a tiresome repetition of the same languid, frivolous scene, performed by actors that seemed to sleep in all their motions. The continual swimming of these phantoms before my eyes, gave me a swimming of the head, which was also affected by the foul air, circulating through such a number of rotten human bellows. I, therefore, retreated towards the door, and stood in the passage to the next room, talking to my friend Quinn, when an end being put to the minuets, the benches were removed to make way for the country dances, and the multitude rising at once, the whole atmosphere was put in commotion. Then, all of a sudden, came rushing upon me an Egyptian gale, so impregnated with pestilential vapors, that my nerves were overpowered, and I dropped senseless upon the floor. You may easily conceive what a clamor and confusion this accident must have produced, in such an assembly. I soon recovered, however, and found myself in an easy chair, supported by my own people. Sister Tabby, in her great tenderness, had put me to the torture, squeezing my hand under her arm, and stuffing my nose with spirit of hartshorn, till the whole inside was excoriated. I no sooner got home, than I sent for Dr. Ch., who assured me I needed not be alarmed, for my swooning was entirely occasioned by an accidental impression of fetid effluvia upon nerves of uncommon sensibility. I know not how other people's nerves are constructed, but one would imagine they must be made of very coarse materials, to stand the shock of such a torrid assault. It was, indeed, a compound of villainous smells, in which the most violent stinks, and the most powerful perfumes, contended for the mastery. Imagine to yourself a high exalted essence of mingled odors, arising from putrid gums, imposthumated lungs, sour flatulencies, rank armpits, sweating feet, running sores and issues, plasters, ointments, and imbrications, Hungary water, spirit of lavender, asaphoetida drops, musk, hartshorn, and sal volatile, besides 1,000 frowsy steams, which I could not analyze. Such, O Dick, is the fragrant ether we breathe in the polite assemblies of Bath. Such is the atmosphere I have exchanged for the pure, elastic, animating air of the Welsh mountains. O Russ, quando ti aspiciam! I wonder what the devil possessed me, but few words are best. I have taken my resolution. You may well suppose I don't intend to entertain the company with a second exhibition. I have promised, in an evil hour, to proceed to London, and that promise shall be performed, but my stay in the metropolis shall be brief. I have, for the benefit of my health, projected an expedition to the north, which, I hope, will afford some agreeable pastime. I have never travelled farther that way than Scarborough, and, I think, it is a reproach upon me, as a British freeholder, to have lived so long without making an excursion to the other side of the Tweed. Besides, I have some relations settled in Yorkshire, to whom it may not be improper to introduce my nephew and his sister. At present, I have nothing to add, but that Tabby is happily disentangled from the Irish baronet, and that I will not fail to make you acquainted, from time to time, with the sequel of our adventures, a mark of consideration, which, perhaps, you would willingly dispense with in your humble servant, M. Bramble, Bath, May. To Sir Watkin Phillips, of Jesus College, Uxon. Dear Phillips, a few days ago we were terribly alarmed by my uncle's fainting at the ball. He has been ever since cursing his own folly, for going thither at the request of an impertinent woman. He declares, he will sooner visit a house infected with the plague, than trust himself in such a nauseous spittle for the future, for he swears the accident was occasioned by the stench of the crowd, and that he would never desire a stronger proof of our being made of very gross materials, than our having withstood the annoyance, by which he was so much discomposed. For my part, I am very thankful for the coarseness of my organs, being in no danger of ever falling a sacrifice to the delicacy of my nose. Mr. Bramble is extravagantly delicate in all his sensations, both of soul and body. I was informed by Dr. Lewis, that he once fought a duel with an officer of the Horse Guards, for turning aside to the park wall, on a necessary occasion, when he was passing with a lady under his protection. His blood rises at every instance of insolence and cruelty, even where he himself is no way concerned, and ingratitude makes his teeth chatter. On the other hand, the recital of a generous, humane, or grateful action, never fails to draw from him tears of approbation, which he is often greatly distressed to conceal. Yesterday, One Paunceford gave tea, on particular invitation. This man, after having been long buffeted by adversity, went abroad, and fortune, resolved to make him amends for her former coyness, set him all at once up to the very ears in affluence. He has now emerged from and blazes out in all the tinsel of the times. I don't find that he is charged with any practices that the law deems dishonest, or that his wealth has made him arrogant and inaccessible. On the contrary, he takes great pains to appear affable and gracious. But, they say, he is remarkable for shrinking from his former friendships, which were generally too plain, and homespun to appear amidst his present brilliant connections, and that he seems uneasy at sight of some old benefactors, whom a man of honor would take pleasure to acknowledge. Be that as it may, he had so effectually engaged the company at Bath, that when I went with my uncle to the coffee-house in the evening, there was not a soul in the room but one person, seemingly in years, who sat by the fire, reading one of the papers. Mr. Bramble, taking his station close by him. "There is such a crowd and confusion of chairs in the passage to Simpson's," said he, "that we could hardly get along. I wish those minions of fortune would fall upon more laudable ways of spending their money. I suppose, sir, you like this kind of entertainment as little as I do?" "I cannot say I have any great relish for such entertainments," answered the other, without taking his eyes off the paper. "Mr. Cyril," resumed my uncle, "I beg pardon for interrupting you, but I can't resist the curiosity I have to know if you received a card on this occasion?" The man seemed surprised at this address, and made some pause, as doubtful what answer he should make. "I know my curiosity is impertinent," added my uncle, "but I have a particular reason for asking the favor." "If that be the case," replied Mr. Cyril, "I shall gratify you without hesitation, by owning that I have had no card. But, give me leave, sir, to ask in my turn, what reason you think I have to expect such an invitation from the gentleman who gives tea?" "I have my own reasons," cried Mr. Bramble, with some emotion, "and am convinced, more than ever, that this Paunceford is a contemptible fellow." "Sir," said the other, laying down the paper, "I have not the honor to know you, but your discourse is a little mysterious, and seems to require some explanation. The person you are pleased to treat so cavalierly, is a gentleman of some consequence in the community, and, for aught you know, I may also have my particular reasons for defending his character. If I was not convinced of the contrary," observed the other, "I should not have gone so far. Let me tell you, sir," said the stranger, raising his voice, "you have gone too far, in hazarding such reflections." Here he was interrupted by my uncle, who asked peevishly if he was Don Quixote enough, at this time of day, to throw down his gauntlet as champion for a man who had treated him with such ungrateful neglect. "For my part," added he, "I shall never quarrel with you again upon this subject, and what I have said now, has been suggested as much by my regard for you, as by my contempt of him." Mr. Cyril, then pulling off his spectacles, eyed uncle very earnestly, saying, in a mitigated tone, "Surely I am much obliged. Ah, Mr. Bramble, I now recollect your features, though I have not seen you these many years." "We might have been less strangers to one another," answered the squire, "if our correspondence had not been interrupted, in consequence of a misunderstanding, occasioned by this but no matter, Mr. Cyril, I esteem your character, and my friendship, such as it is, you may freely command. The offer is too agreeable to be declined," said he. "I embrace it very cordially, and, as the first fruits of it, request that you will change this subject, which, with me, is a matter of peculiar delicacy." My uncle owned he was in the right, and the discourse took a more general turn. Mr. Cyril passed the evening with us at our lodgings, and appeared to be intelligent, and even entertaining, but his disposition was rather of a melancholy hue. My uncle says he is a man of uncommon parts, and unquestioned probity, that his fortune, which was originally small, has been greatly hurt by a romantic spirit of generosity, which he has often displayed, even at the expense of his discretion, in favour of worthless individuals, that he had rescued Paunceford from the lowest distress, when he was bankrupt, both in means and reputation, that he had espoused his interests with a degree of enthusiasm, broke with several friends, and even drawn his sword against my uncle, who had particular reasons for questioning the moral character of the said Paunceford, that, without Cyril's countenance and assistance, the other never could have embraced the opportunity, which has raised him to this pinnacle of wealth, that Paunceford, in the first transports of his success, had written, from abroad, letters to different correspondents, owning his obligations to Mr. Cyril, in the warmest terms of acknowledgment, and declared he considered himself only as a factor for the occasions of his best friend, that, without doubt, he had made declarations of the same nature to his benefactor himself, though this last was always silent and reserved on the subject, but for some years, those tropes and figures of rhetoric had been disused, that, upon his return to England, he had been lavish in his caresses to Mr. Cyril, invited him to his house, and pressed him to make it his own, that he had overwhelmed him with general professions, and affected to express the warmest regard for him, in company of their common acquaintance, so that everybody believed his gratitude was liberal as his fortune, and some went so far as to congratulate Mr. Cyril on both. All this time Paunceford carefully and artfully avoided particular discussions with his old patron, who had too much spirit to drop the most distant hint of balancing the account of obligation, that, nevertheless, a man of his feelings could not but resent this shocking return for all his kindness, and, therefore, he withdrew himself from the connection, without coming to the least explanation or speaking a syllable on the subject to any living soul, so that now their correspondence is reduced to a slight salute with the hat, when they chance to meet in any public place, an accident that rarely happens, for their walks lie different ways. Mr. Paunceford lives in a palace, feeds upon dainties, is arrayed in sumptuous apparel, appears in all the pomp of equipage, and passes his time among the nobles of the land. Cyril lodges in Stall Street, up 2 pair of stairs backwards, walks a foot in a bath rug, eats for 12 shillings a week, and drinks water as preservative against the gout and gravel. Mark the vicissitude. Paunceford once resided in a garret, where he subsisted upon sheep's trotters and cow heel, from which commons he was translated to the table of Cyril, that ever abounded with good cheer, until want of economy and retention reduced him to a slender annuity in his decline of years, that scarce affords the bare necessaries of life. Paunceford, however, does him the honour to speak of him still, with uncommon regard, and to declare what pleasure it would give him to contribute in any shape, to his convenience, but you know, he never fails to add, he's a shy kind of a man, and then such a perfect philosopher, that he looks upon all superfluities with the most sovereign contempt. Having given you this sketch of Squire Paunceford, I need not make any comment on his character, but leave it at the mercy of your own reflection, from which I dare say, it will meet with as little quarter as it has found with yours always, J. Melford.